Support for the Brewlosophy podcast comes from the following. Love to Brew is a national leader in homebrewing supplies, offering exclusive products such as East Coast yeast, TV taps, and Brewlosophy recipe kits, all with free shipping on orders over $75. When you need brewing ingredients or equipment, check out Love to Brew at love2brew.com. The best beer requires the best hops, which Yakima Valley Hops provides fresh from the source to brewers around the world. Find everything from classics to modern favorites, as well as cool experimental varieties and a vast array of ingredients and gear at yakimavalleyhops.com. Hey everybody, welcome back to the Brewlosophy podcast. Today we're bringing you a show that is all about packaging your beer. That's right, everything from bottling to kegging and carbonating and all of the fun stuff we do to make that beer finally drinkable after it's done fermenting. I'm excited to get into this topic with my friend Jake. How you doing, Jake?
I'm doing great, Marshall.
Today is the 19th. Well, that's the day that this podcast is going to be released. And we usually record the episodes the day before they get released. We record them kind of earlier in the day. I spend all day editing them, and then we prepare them and push them out on in the evening so that people can listen to it on the way to work on Tuesdays. So this one's a little bit different. It's actually a couple weeks ahead of time, which means that just yesterday, if you're listening to this podcast now, we got home from HomebrewCon 2017 in Minneapolis, Minnesota. So I'm gonna ask you this, Jay. How was HomebrewCon, man?
From what I can remember, it was great.
Yeah, my fear in recording this the actual day after HomebrewCon is that maybe our brain cells wouldn't replenish enough, or we were too exhausted because I'm sure it would be because of jet lag or something like that. But I'm going to go ahead and say that HomebrewCon was an absolute blast. We hung out with some awesome people. The Chop and Brew Pre-Funk was the most memorable aspect, of course. People like Drew Beecham and Chip Walton got up and did amazing karaoke songs, and it was just an awesome time. So pay attention to next year because HomebrewCon is going to be they announced it, Portland, Oregon. Holy cow, Portland. It's like the brewing capital of the West Coast. If you're on the West Coast, this is the place you're going to want to be for HomebrewCon 2018. Mark your calendars. It's going to be awesome.
Portland is like my second home, so I'm so excited for this one.
Oh, I know. Me too, man. And I've got family who are just a couple hours north in the Seattle area. I think it's going to be pretty epic. We are already thinking about and talking about the Chop and Brew Pre-Funk Party 2018. So if you know any breweries that would like to host such a party, let me know. That'd be awesome. So HomebrewCon 2017, it was a blast. 2018's coming up, Portland, Oregon. Mark your calendars. It's going to be rad. I wanted to let people know as well that we still have the Brewlosophy store. In the store, it's very underpopulated with merchandise right now. And a part of that, the reason for that is because it takes a while for things to get printed and shipped to us. And we are still organizing how we want to manage getting that stuff back out to you guys. But we do have some stuff in there. We've got some mesh back hats that you can buy. We've got Brutality belts. And we are working on getting some more taster glasses. Now, we're going to have a couple different varieties with some different images on them to choose from. So go take a look, brewlosophy.com/store. If you have any ideas for merchandise that you'd like to see in the store, please do let me know. I'm open to any ideas. If people want it, there's no reason for me not to look into getting it to you guys. And I think it's a lot of fun having you guys sport our stuff, making Brewlosophy look good. Take a look. If you have any Brew and A questions, make sure to email me or let us know in one of the forums that you were regularly commenting on. Ask any question you want about our perspectives on stuff, about how we approach the experimental stuff, whatever it is. We'll answer any questions. We are not looking for experiment suggestions. Those are fantastic all the time. We will add any suggestions to our ever-growing list. But for the Brew and A episodes of the Brewlosophy podcast, which we plan to drop very, very soon, the first episode, we are looking for questions, real questions about stuff that we've done, thoughts about things that maybe we haven't done. Anything you want to know about us, we will answer. You can email me directly at marshall@brewlosophy.com with those questions. If you'd like to support brewlosophy.com and the Brewlosophy podcast, you can head over to brewlosophy.com/support. Where you'll find a huge list of all of the great homebrew shops and other places that are supporting us by giving us a commission whenever you shop at their websites through our links. And your shopping experience won't change a single bit and we get a little kickback that helps us to keep bringing you this fun stuff. Hey, so Jake, I haven't really talked to you guys about this too much because it's been kind of a personal idea of mine, but we're going to be integrating some new segments into the Brewlosophy podcast. Now here we are on episode 6, this thing, the train is kind of rolling. And as I'm going back and every once in a while, I kind of re-listen or I'm editing, the shows that we put out there, it starts to feel a little bit intense. And I know there are people out there who just really like the serious stuff and the experiments and want to keep it focused on that. But then there are those who kind of like a little bit more lightheartedness. And so I came up with an idea to integrate a kind of a 1-minute beer review segment. It'll only be about a minute, maybe 2. And it'll be a section where I have a couple of my best friends on the show who aren't homebrewers necessarily, who enjoy beer, and I'm going to serve them a beer blind and have them evaluate it without knowing what the beer is. And I think it'll be a lot of fun. And then we'll talk a little bit about what the beer is. I'll have them reveal it during the show. So that's my idea. I've already got the stuff set up and we've already got a fun little intro lick. So stay tuned for that in the future. I'm not sure exactly when that's going to come out. I got to get these guys over here at the same time, but it should be a lot of fun.
Oh, I'm pretty excited for that one. From what you say about your neighbors, this should be a blast.
Yeah, I feel, there are those times where you live in a neighborhood and you're just kind of like, I wish I had something to do. That's never the case for me. I feel very fortunate to have these dorks in my neighborhood. And the fact that they've agreed to do this with me, I consider it my way of sort of spreading the love that I experience on a very regular basis here in Fresno, California. So the topic of today's show is basically on packaging beer after it's done fermenting. Now, that can take a number of forms, and when we package is also when we carbonate. So we figured we would kind of throw in some discussion about that as well. We've done some experiments on this. We're going to talk about different experiments we've done on different styles of packaging and get into our thoughts on what we think is best. As soon as we're back from this short break, stay with us. After a long brew day, the last thing I want to do is waste time chilling work, which is why I use cleverly designed immersion chillers from Jaded Brewing. After some bad experiences with counterflow and plate chillers, I began the search for a more efficient chilling solution and discovered Jaded. That was nearly 4 years ago, and to this day, I continue to rely on the King Cobra and the Hydra to chill my wort in record time without the setup or cleaning hassle of other chillers. If you're looking for a way to optimize your brew day, I can't recommend Jaded chillers enough. Go see what they have to offer at jadedbrewing.com and let them know Brewlosophy sent you. When it comes to packaging beer post-fermentation, I think a lot of homebrewers, mostly because of cost and the fact that the equipment is included in their kits, most people start with bottle conditioning, which is a pretty simple process that takes a little bit of time. It requires racking the beer from a fermenter into a bottling bucket with some sort of a sugary solution, and then racking that back into bottles or into bottles and allowing the remnant yeast to consume that sugar and produce carbon dioxide, which is then absorbed into the beer because the package is capped and you get carbonation. And of course, there are other ways to carbonate as well. But I do think most of us start off with bottle conditioning.
Yeah, totally. I know I did for sure. I bottled for quite a while before I switched over to kegs. Probably the two most popular methods for people to consume homebrew are bottle and kegs, and we'll definitely hit on those both. But I know people are also doing some crazy stuff with beer engines and, tapping them out of firkins and stuff like that. We probably won't touch on those as much, but we're definitely going to talk quite a bit about bottle conditioning and then kegging as well. So when we talk about bottle conditioning, kind of as Marshall said, we're talking about using some sort of sugar, something that yeast can use to produce carbon dioxide in a volume that you desire as a way to package your beer and naturally carbonate it at the same time. In order to do this, it's not as simple as just, when I first started, I just wanted to dump 2/3 of a cup of sugar in your finished beer and then bottle it. It's not quite that simple. There are a few inputs that we need to know to be able to actually carbonate it accurately and consistently.
And you're referring to kind of like dialing it into the carbonation that we prefer for a specific style or for whatever it is I want that kind of the fizziness to be in my beer.
Right, exactly. I mean, I think most of us, we probably serve most of our beers around 10 to 12 PSI. I don't know what that calculates to in volumes, but when you look at the style guidelines and you look at what people write about different beer styles, oftentimes they'll include serving volumes in there. And I think things like English ales and stouts might be on the lower side, and things like those Belgian saisons might be on the higher side. And then the rest of the beer somewhere in between.
Right. Yeah. You know, I remember back when I first started getting into English ales and, following the style guidelines, I'd make an ESB or I would make a nice mild, and I'm pouring it off my keg, and there's basically no head. There's very little fizz in the beer, which I didn't find totally pleasing, but everyone was telling me that that's how it has to be, which I think kind of begs the question, what's more important, the style guidelines or personal preference?
Right, and that's something that's going to be different for everybody.
So when we bottle condition, what exactly is happening in that process? We're putting beer with some sugar into a bottle, we're capping it off, and then we're waiting for a while.
Right, so basically at the end of fermentation, we've got this 5 gallons of beer or whatever you brew in terms of your gallons. There's a lot of yeast left in suspension. I know if you're somebody that doesn't cold crash and you get your beer right away, it's got a little haze to it, and some of that haze is definitely yeast. We lose a lot of it during fermentation, but there's still some left. So when we add sugar, just think about it like adding new wort. So we're adding more fermentables to the beer. And as we know from fermentation, that CO2 gas is releasing, except this time we're capping it off and letting that CO2 grow in the bottle to carbonate to whatever specific CO2 volume we want. So in order to calculate a specific volume of CO2 that we want, we need to know a few things first off. So the maximum temperature that was reached during fermentation, because during fermentation, CO2 will reach a certain equilibrium with the pressure of the air outside, and some of that CO2 will be released and some of it will actually stay in your fermenting beer. Yeah, so that maximum temperature reached during fermentation, there's going to be a certain amount of CO2 dispelled, so there's some left over, so we need to account for that as we're calculating our specific amount of sugar to create the volumes we want.
Yeah, and there's another thing about bottle conditioning that I've been asked quite a bit, and I don't bottle condition. God, I haven't done it in a long time, years, and even then it was like once or twice in the past over 12 or 13 years at this point. But one of the questions that I get asked is, what temperature do you plug into the bottle condition calculators? There's a great one over at brewunited.com that I think a lot of people are using these days. Really well done. There's a section that asks to plug in a temperature, and people who cold crash, who have the ability to cold crash, ask me, do I put in the temperature that I cold crashed it to, or do I put in the temperature that it was fermenting at? And it sounds like what you're saying is that it's that max temperature that it hit.
Yeah, I also haven't bottle conditioned for quite a while, and when I did, I never did cold crash. But from what I can find, reading online and in some literature, is it's that maximum temperature, because at that maximum temperature you reach during fermentation, the CO2 goes out into the atmosphere, and then when you cold crash, it doesn't come back into the beer.
No, that's my understanding as well. When I've looked into it, is that, and I'm pretty sure Olin over at brewunited.com has confirmed this with me, that what you're looking for is, how much CO2, how much carbonation do I actually want to absorb into this beer, given how much is theoretically in there based on fermentation temperature and your original gravity. And so the warmer it gets, it's going to expel that CO2. And as you cold crash from there, it's not like it's sucking CO2 back in. If anything, it's sucking oxygen in.
Right.
That's not going to have any impact on carbonation. So yeah, that temperature setting, just for the record, you want to put the warmest you brought that temp to. So if you are fermenting a beer at 68 degrees or 66 degrees or whatever it is, and you ramp it up to say 72 degrees like I do, to encourage complete attenuation and getting rid of those off flavors, you're going to want to put 72 as that temperature.
Yep. So after you've got that temperature figured out, that max temperature that you've reached during fermentation, you're going to want to also know your desired carbonation level. So we kind of talked about that could be different for each style. It's generally noted in volumes in all the calculators that I can find online. talk about it in terms of volumes of CO2 that you want.
Right.
Then you also need to know the volume of your packaged beer. At Brew United, there's a nice calculator, so you can go there, plug in those specific amounts, and I think they even have a nice drop down for the type of sugar you're using, and then it'll tell you how much sugar to use to carbonate your beer.
Yeah, super convenient. The last time I did a bottle conditioned beer, it was when I was beta testing for the Yeast Bay, and Nick over at the Yeast Bay had sent us he sent Ed Coffey and Brian Hall and myself some 4 different Brettanomyces strains that he had isolated, and we were testing those out, and he wanted to see how they tasted both force carbed and bottle conditioned. Oh boy, back in the days when I had some time to do this stuff. And yeah, I relied on the Brew United calculator there, and it worked absolutely beautifully. There's another thing that I did that I think we'll get into talking about a little bit later with some batches for the Yeast Bay, where I actually naturally carbonated in the keg.
All right, awesome. So now that you've kind of figured out, how much sugar you're going to need to get to your desired carbonation level, you should probably do this part actually first, but you can actually carbonate your beer with any different type of fermentable sugar. So people commonly use corn sugar, but I've also seen people use cane sugar, brown sugar, molasses, maltose even from like DME or LME. Basically anything that has fermentable sugars can be used to produce CO2.
Do you have any idea why corn sugar or dextrose became so popular for bottle conditioning? This is something I've wondered about and I've never actually researched. And I guess it would have been smart of me to do that before we recorded this episode. But I don't get why that became popular when table sugar is so cheap.
From what I remember from when I first started bottle conditioning, and I was told corn sugar. Apparently cane sugar or beet sugar can leave some sort of cidery astringency, whereas corn sugar is thought to be taste neutral. Now, whether or not that's true might be a good experiment.
It might be, yeah. I think that's a great experiment. Whoever wants to, volunteer to bottle condition beers after so long. But the one thing I always experienced with corn sugar is that it seems to dissolve a little bit quicker than table sugar does. I think the crystals are much finer. And if that's any benefit, the only other thing, I was talking to somebody, a couple of years ago, who mentioned that when you're buying in bulk, corn sugar ends up being a little bit less expensive than especially cane sugar, but beet sugar or table sugar in general. So perhaps that has to do with it as well, or maybe it was another kind of carryover from the professional brewing world. That's what they were using, and so we kind of followed suit.
It could be. I definitely don't know. Also, like other sugar types, like brown sugar and molasses, are thought to actually carry over additional flavors to the ending beer. I know I've never bottle conditioned with those. Some people use honey, things like that, but people do say that those carry over flavors to the final beer.
Yeah, I've my brother actually. When he first started brewing a few years ago, he sent me a brown ale that he made that I believe he bottle conditioned with brown sugar or maple. Maybe it was maple syrup, because he lives in a region that is really they make a lot of maple syrup there, and I didn't. I don't think I was able to detect the maple flavor carryover, but the amount used for bottle conditioning probably isn't that much. That any flavor gets so diluted and then maybe a little bit overrun. It was a brown ale by some of the roasted malts and whatnot.
Yeah, I'd be interested to try a few. Like I said, I've never done it, and I'm not sure I've ever had a beer bottled with those. I just know that people do talk about that. But regardless, all these different sugars can be used to bottle condition. Turbinado sugar, pretty much anything that yeast will eat can be used. So something like lactose, which our specific strain of yeast would not eat, probably shouldn't be used for bottle conditioning, as it likely wouldn't be carbonated then.
Yeah, you absolutely should not use lactose because it's a non-fermentable. It's largely non-fermentable, and it's used for those who like milk stouts or cream stouts. That's what's used to give it that kind of thick, unctuous sweetness.
Mm-hmm. But the takeaway kind of from this is that different sugars do have different potentials in terms of their fermentability. So you do need to research that a little bit and find out how fermentable what you're putting in there is. I believe that cane sugar is a little bit more fermentable than corn sugar. and then brown sugar, molasses, maltose, etc. as you get down the line.
Absolutely. And this is another area where these online calculators just make your life 100 times easier, because most of them have options for a lot of these different types of sugar. And so all you have to do is plug in your packaging volume, plug in those temperatures, click a button, and you've basically got your, you've got the amount of sugar that you're using based on the type that you're going with.
Right. So then now that we've got our measured out amount of sugar that we need, in order to naturally carbonate it, the yeast needs to be present. Basically, kind of going off our last episode that we published, this carbonation is a re-fermentation in the bottle or the keg, however you're choosing to naturally carbonate. So we need to have yeast present. So if this is a beer that you've been bulk aging for maybe a year and a half, there might not be yeast present, so you might need to add additional active yeast to your bottling bucket to be able to ferment that sugar that you're adding in order to carbonate.
That's a commonly discussed issue as well. Like, is there enough yeast in solution to carbonate beer if it's been sitting around for a long time, if you've been bulk aging? And, in my experience and from what I've heard, again, anecdotally from folks who do still bottle condition aged beers, for the most part, there is enough yeast in suspension. The question is, how quickly is it going to take, and how much yeast is there? And so what I've heard is that some people will add a little bit of like a champagne yeast or even something as simple as like, US-05 or just any other dry yeast, just a little bit, add it back while they're racking over to the bottling bucket, just to ensure that there's enough yeast for that carbonation. But a lot of people start to freak out after 2 or 3 weeks if their beer's not carbonated yet, when really it could just be that it needs a little bit more time.
I know when I first started brewing beer, and I was actually bottle conditioning, after a few days you start opening those because you want to try your stuff right away and it's not carbonated, and you start freaking out and checking out the internet. It's likely going to be okay.
The internet being the one thing that'll freak anyone out, right? We should start brewmd.com and really freak people out and list all the symptoms of things at the very end. It's like, it's probably not the case, and Right. So anyways, so once you get these beers in the bottle, or you get the sugar added, where do you go from there?
Right. So then after you add that sugar to your bottling bucket, you either use a racking cane, or just open the spigot and dump it into the bottle. And then put a cap on there and crimp it down with a capper. And then you let your beer sit for a while. It needs to sit at probably room temperature. It could probably be, plus or minus a few degrees. It shouldn't really be detrimental if you bottle condition a lager at ale temperatures. Basically, all you want to happen is for the yeast to consume that sugar, produce the CO2 you want, and then stop.
Yeah, I have some friends, again, who are making lager beers and don't have the ability to keg at this point. And, I remember talking to them a couple of years ago, and they're concerned about, the yeast being out, and I don't want to get the beer too warm. And, given the fact that they're making these lagers using traditional methods and are presumably they're cool with the time it takes to make that, beer will certainly carbonate over a period of time if you keep it relatively cool and bottle condition using standard methods. I've had delicious Pilsners and Helles made this way that were bottle conditioned at about 50 degrees, 55 degrees. It took a long ass time, but if you're making a lager and you're cool with that, then there's no reason to do that. I think a lot of people these days, though, are making those lagers and letting them bottle, once they get that beer packaged, again, putting in the warmest temperature at which it was sitting into that calculator, they get that beer packaged, they allow it to kind of warm up to maybe 60, 65 degrees so that carbonation step doesn't take so long.
Yeah, I know when I was bottle conditioning, I always stuck them in the warmest room in my house, just to make sure that got done ASAP.
Yeah, exactly. I'm the same way. Well, and that's mostly a function of my impatience, but,
right.
Throw it in the laundry room right above the dryer, and those things are carbonated in 4 days. Yeast, like any other living organism, is going to react a bit quicker if it's warmer. So keep that in mind.
Yeah.
One of the other questions that I get often about bottle conditioning has to do with the impact of fining, or how fining with gelatin is going to impact bottle conditioning and the time it takes, or even if it's possible, because it's presumed that fining helps to pull that yeast out of the beer in order to make it clear.
I do not have any experience bottle conditioning gelatin fine beer. I've definitely bottle conditioned cold crashed beer before, Like when I was brewing and bottling with lagers, cold crashed, let to sit for a few weeks, warmed back up, bottled, and it was fine. But not gelatin. I would assume there is enough yeast left, though.
There is absolutely enough yeast left. Billions and billions of yeast exist in the beer that we make. Even after it's dropped out, after your beer is mostly clear, there is usually going to be more than enough yeast left to carbonate that beer. And the experiences that I've never carbonated or I've never bottle conditioned gelatin fine beer before myself. But again, my brother and a few of the friends that I've got whose beer I've tasted, they've brought beers over to me. Crystal clear bottle conditioned beer with just the tiniest dusting on the bottom of the bottle, which to me is a beautiful thing. None of this big old trube cake on the bottom of the bottle. Perfectly carbonated pale ales, IPAs, Pilsners. I'm dead serious. Gelatin fining does not seem to have an impact. Now, again, like with long-term aging, the one thing that I have heard is that it can take a little bit longer, upwards of a week or two longer than one might normally wait. But you give it that warm temperature, you give it enough fermentable sugar, and it's going to carbonate. That has been at least the experience of the people that I've talked to who use gelatin fining.
That's definitely encouraging for bottle conditioners out there who want clear beer.
Yeah, I think so too.
One thing that I've seen a lot of people talk about, and I was pretty concerned about when I was bottle conditioning, was related to, how do you know that your beer is done fermenting and it's ready to bottle? Especially with beers that are, very high attenuating, like maybe a Saison or a mixed fermentation sour beer. When is this ready to bottle? You should probably take some hydrometer readings, maybe for 3 days in a row, make sure it's at the same specific gravity 3 days in a row before you bottle it. Just because with bottle conditioning, something that's different from kegging is that bottle can only hold so much PSI, whereas a keg can hold, I think, 130 PSI. A bottle is significantly lower than that. So if you bottle up a beer that's not fully fermented, you risk having bottles explode in your basement or your guest bedroom or your kid's closet, which, might not be too
good for the marriage. Let's be real.
Yeah, you might not have a happy wife when you come back.
Yeah. Well, and there's a bunch of little tricks and tips that I've heard for monitoring carbonation levels. One of my favorite being, I've never done this, but one of my favorite being to make one bottle in or bottle at least one beer in like a PET bottle. So you can get a regular old soda bottle. Doesn't matter if it's brown or clear, and bottle the same amount, do your typical thing. And as that beer starts to carbonate, the plastic bottle is going to expand, and it should get to a point where it's pretty doggone full, and you can keep that in a closed container. Get a bucket, put a cap on that bucket, keep it out in your garage, whatever. And if it explodes, to start moving those beers away. But if you bottle condition, the glass bottles, start putting those in the cold or do something. But get out of headshot, whatever. But if you bottle condition correctly, properly, and based on the calculator, and everything else is good and it's not contaminated, that beer will get very, very tight in the plastic bottle and remain that way. And you can then go and chill that down. And as you chill it, once you chill it, you can open it very carefully so it doesn't explode in your face, and taste and sample the beer that way and see if it's reached the proper carbonation level, and then determine where you want to go from there. So cool little tip there. There are other ways of naturally conditioning and carbonating beer that I just think we should mention real quick before we head into our break.
Right. So German Kraisening is one of the methods that people commonly use here in the United States and around the world. And that's basically their workaround to remain in compliance with the Reinheitsgebot.
The Reinheitsgebot.
So basically what they would do is they would brew a second beer, take a portion of that second beer and add it to their finished fermenting beer, cap off the fermentation, and let those beers carbonate naturally, because they couldn't add sugar or any other fermentables to carbonate their beer. In modern homebrewing, if you're using a keg, what you can just do is put a spunding valve on there if it appeases you to do the Kraisening method. Or you could also keg your beer before fermentation is finished. with the spunding valve and let that naturally carbonate to your desired PSI.
Yeah, there are people out there who claim that produces a finer carbonation that's more, I guess, in line with some of the Bavarian and German beers that people are enjoying. So it's definitely worth a try. If you go to brewlosophy.com and search for spunding valve, you'll see a little how-to buried in an experiment that Greg Foster did. So check it out. When we come back from the break, we're going to move into forced carbonation methods and talk a little bit more about the way that Jake and I carbonate our beer. If, like me, you prefer the simpler side of brewing beer, you have got to check out the Brew Bag, a food-safe fabric filter that allows for mashing of the finest crushed grain without risking the dreaded stuck sparge. I've been recommending these things since I started using them. They are awesome. The Brew Bag offers the only completely reinforced fabric filter for brewing that can be used over 100 times and comes in sizes that fit most mash tuns, or you can even have one custom made. Go check the Brew Bag out at brewinabag.com and be sure to use promo code TBP17 to get 10% off your order of $30 or more. For a growing number of homebrewers today, bottle conditioning has gone the way of the dodo. People don't like the process, and there are those who will claim that it's very zen, and I'm here to claim that those people are only claiming that because they haven't started kegging yet. And I mean no offense when I say that, but I moved into kegging, goodness gracious, 7 years ago now, and from the very first batch, I realized that it was that transition that was going to keep me in brewing. It allowed for much quicker carbonation through forced carbonation, and it was just a bunch easier, less cleaning, all of that stuff. So when it comes to kegging, though, there are a few different ways that people have come up with to force carbonate.
Yeah, like you, the switch to kegging definitely kept me in the hobby. I know I can't count how many times I made a mess on my kitchen floor trying to bottle beer, and my wife was not very happy about it. But kegging kept everything, out of the kitchen and nice and easy. But basically the method that I use, and the one I think that's pretty popular, is just finishing up your beer in your fermenter, racking it to the keg, closing the lid, and then putting it in your keezer and setting it to a specific PSI.
For most, that's the pressure that you end up serving the beer at. It's very popular, kind of a common average number, it seems, for PSI is about 12 PSI. You set your regulator to 12 PSI. You're pumping that amount of gas into your beer in your keg. You don't put it on and then take it off or do anything like that. It's a constant flow of 12 PSI, and then you let it sit, right? It's sort of like bottle conditioning without the sugar and without the step of racking to a bucket and transferring it after that. You let it sit for a couple of weeks until the CO2 equalizes in the beer and it's ready to drink.
Yeah, because of the small surface area of the corny kegs that we use, the CO2 exchange with the liquid doesn't happen very fast. So it takes about a week to 10 days if you just set it at the serving PSI. So in come some modified methods on how to get your beer sparkle and fizzy faster.
Sparkle and fizz, baby. Yeah, we did an article on this whole carbonation thing called Sparkle and Fizz. You can Google it, and it goes over all of these methods in detail. And I'll tell you what, Jake, when I first started kegging, I was so terrified of screwing something up. And I'll admit, of like a keg blowing up in my face and like taking out my entire house, that it took me a while to move away from some of these older methods, or to adopt a new method. The first one that I tried being I don't even know what the term is that they use now, but it's like the shake like crazy method, high and shaky or something.
Yeah, I think I tried that method a few times when I first started kegging. Basically what it does is it increases the surface area of your beer in contact with CO2 and allows it to carbonate quicker. It's kind of similar to commercial inline carbonation. So you'll hook up your beer to your gas, turn the PSI up to, I don't know what's commonly said, about 30 or so, and then just sit there and shake the keg, roll it back and forth to increase that pressure and get that CO2 more evenly distributed. And supposedly that carbonates your beer fast. I had some success with it, but then one time some beer went up in my gas line when I was rolling it outside, and I kind of stopped doing that.
There are some definite risks, and maybe some are unfounded, but there are some definitely discussed risks, at least, to doing the crank and shake method, as it were. And, one of them is, like you said, some beer getting up into a gas line, which sounds like it shouldn't happen because gas is coming in at such a high pressure, but it happens quite often. I've heard from a few people who this has happened to. I think another concern that's been expressed is that in increasing that surface area, you're also giving it more access to whatever oxygen is left over in that keg. So if you're not, pushing sanitizer out of your keg every time you keg, which I don't do, by shaking it like that, presumably you run the risk of oxidizing your beer maybe a bit quicker than if you don't shake it. But it is a popular method that I've used. I used it probably 10, 15 times a few years ago, and it worked. If you're in a rush to get a beer out to a party or something, you can do that. In my experience, one of the things you have to pay attention to, though, is you have to give the beer a little bit of time to settle, because just like any old package of carbonated drink, if you shake it up, it's going to foam. And that was my experience. I would take, ice cold beer, keg it up, crank and shake for about 15, 20 minutes at 30 PSI, throw it in my keezer. It's still cold, and the first pour was just a glass of foam. So you do have to give it some time to settle. But does it work? Yeah. I guess the other risk would be you run the risk of overcarbonating your beer, because it's really difficult to measure really how long or how much carbonation is being absorbed into the beer.
Yeah. Other than the mess I had with the gas line, it was just too imprecise for what I wanted to do. How long do you sit and shake it for? Is 30 minutes enough? Is 20 minutes enough? What PSI? Between that method and just setting it at serving pressure and letting it sit, I would have probably opted for just setting it at serving pressure and letting it sit, until I found out about a new method, and one that I think most of us have definitely implemented into our brewing.
Oh yeah. My favorite method, I don't know if I'll ever make a beer or carbonate a beer without using the burst carbonation method, which is relatively, it seems kind of like a new thing among some home brewers, though. This is sort of the way bright tanks have been used for a while, at least higher pressure bright tanks that I can tell. And it's one of the ways that commercial breweries are able to get beer out to the public quicker, in a quicker turnaround. They're not letting beer sit at 12 PSI for a long time.
Right. No. So basically this method, using this method, you crank the PSI up to between 30 and 50 and let it sit for between 8 and 48 hours or so. We have a nice little chart on that Sparkle and Fizz website that you talked about earlier. Basically that higher PSI cuts down on the amount of time that you need to get to the lower PSI that you want to serve it from, which makes sense. If you set a beer at 12 PSI, after a day, it's going to maybe be at 1 to 2 PSI. So if you bump that up to 50, then after a day or two, maybe it's at 10 PSI.
And I think maybe talking about in terms of volumes of CO2, if you're, it's just like any other physical thing. If you're pushing a bunch of CO2 and that pressure is really strong on the beer, it's gonna encourage quicker absorption. And so the key with burst carbonation, which was something that I started experimenting with a few years ago, just purely out of curiosity to see if it would work, and it seems to work incredibly well for us. The more pressure that you put on that keg, the quicker the absorption is going to be. And so, if you've got a beer in a keg that's sitting at 12 PSI and it's only pushing 12 PSI of pressure on that beer, then it's going to take quite a while for that carbonation to occur. And maybe after a day, you'll be at, 1 volume of CO2 in the beer. Whereas after a day at, say, 50 PSI, which freaks a lot of people out, but I've been doing it and it's working amazingly well. After a full day at 50 PSI, I'm probably to 2.6 to 2.7 volumes. And I that's keeping my keezer at 40 degrees. I think I have it at 40 degrees right now. And it's perfectly carbonated, which means that if I'm brewing beer and finding it with gelatin and it's carbonated the day after I keg it, that it's basically ready for consumption. So that's pretty cool. And the one risk that we run, again, sort of like with the crank and shake method, is that it's pretty easy to overcarbonate your beer if you leave it on that higher pressure for too long.
Yep. I was using 50 for quite a while, and just based on my work schedule and how often I'm in and out of the house, I had to bring that down to 30 after one time when 50 sat on there for about 36 hours. My beer was overcarbonated.
That happens. And when we overcarb beer, there are easy fixes. Fixing overcarbonated beer isn't that big of a deal. The easiest way to fix it that I've found is just to take the gas off, release what sounds like about half the pressure. You want to leave a little bit on there to ensure that your lid stays seated and all of that. Release all of that. Come back 5-6 hours later. Just keep it in your keezer. You don't even need to warm it up. You come back 5-6 hours later, release it a few more times. You do that over the course of a day or two. There's still enough pressure in there to steal samples every once in a while. And when you're back down to at least, where you want to be in terms of carbonation or even a little bit lower, slap on your gas disconnect, set it to your serving pressure, and it'll finish carbonating over the next day or so. So it's really overcarbonating is annoying. It sucks. It kind of gets in the way, but it's really not an end all. It's, the beer can still turn out really well and it can very easily be fixed.
Right. So once you have your beer carbonated in the keg, if you want to bottle some for competition or for storage for later consumption, that can easily be done with things like counterpressure fillers, using a tap wand and a picnic hose.
The brew bottler,
which is I think what we've been using for quite a while, which is a growler filler connected to your tap, a little piece of tubing, and then a stainless steel rod that goes to the bottom of the bottle. Basically emulates a counterpressure filler. Some of the literature does talk about filling bottles and that it needs to be equal pressure in the bottle and in the serving keg. Otherwise, you'll just get foam.
Yeah, and foaming is one of those issues when bottling from a keg that you just have to learn to deal with. Usually it's going to happen on some level, but by the counterpressure approach does seem to help keep it to a minimum. So ultimately what it is, forced carbonating is a little bit easier and requires a little bit less time than bottle conditioning, but it does require some expenditures. You need to have some specific gear to be able to do this. Obviously, you need to have a CO2 tank with a regulator and all of the tubing and stuff that you need. If you're going to burst carbonate and you want to go high pressure, you're going to have a high pressure regulator, which can be a little bit more expensive than the lower pressure regulators used just for serving beer. But forced carbonating can be done, like we said, right at serving pressure. You just put your beer in there and let it go for a while, and your beer will carbonate. We began to wonder, though, were we missing out on something? Is there something about bottle conditioning that provides a character to the beer or imparts some sort of goodness to a beer that maybe kegging doesn't, or the other way around? So we, as we're wont to do, designed some experiments to test this out.
So far we've done 2 experiments comparing natural carbonation versus forced carbonation. So the one that I actually designed was comparing bottle conditioning versus forced carbonation in a keg. I cut my chops bottle conditioning. I always made beer that I thought was okay, but I felt that when I moved to kegging, my beer significantly improved. So I kind of wanted to validate that for myself and see if it wasn't something else I may have changed along the time. So for this experiment, I brewed a split batch of beer. So everything was brewed in the same kettle, split off the kettle post-boil into 2 fermenters. When fermentation was finished, one was bottled and one was kegged. The kegged beer was placed under pressure in my keezer at 12 psi and just let to slowly carbonate. The other fermenter was ran into a keg where it was mixed with the sugar serving solution, and then from that keg, where it was not under pressure or anything, I just added 1 psi to push that beer into the bottles, bottled them up, left them sit for 2 weeks. Once they were carbonated to about the same as the keezer beer, I threw them in the fridge and took this beer to be evaluated. So for this experiment, we had 24 tasters. In order to reach a p-value of 0.05, we would have needed 14 people to identify the different beer. They were served the beer in opaque cups. 2 were the same, 1 was different. And in the end, 12 tasters accurately identified the odd beer out, giving us a p-value of 0.12. So we were not able to claim that tasters could accurately identify a bottle conditioned beer from a force carbed and a kegged beer.
And what's interesting to me is this, despite the fact that these beers looked as different as they did. I mean, the force carbonated beers definitely got a clarity to it that the bottle conditioned beer just doesn't. And it's funny because in my head, the bottle conditioned beer looks like a bottle conditioned beer, and the type I typically have consumed myself. I'm presuming that you left the dregs in the bottom of the beer, in the bottom of the bottle.
Yeah. Neither beer was fine with gelatin either. That bottle conditioned beer eventually, like after a month or so in the fridge, after the experiment was all done and all the data was collected, it did drop as clear as the one that was in the keezer. But it definitely took, an additional 2 or so weeks.
Yeah, sure. And I guess that's not terribly surprising. I think when you're naturally carbonating like that, you are introducing another thing, yeast, that needs to precipitate out, and that might take a little bit longer. And those beers are sitting warmer, so give them a little bit more time. And I know I've had crystal clear bottle conditioned beers that are absolutely delicious. You'd never guess, that they were. I guess you never guess they were bottle conditioned because they tasted so good. And to me, what these results seem to show is that we shouldn't be guessing that anyways, because a bottle conditioned beer can be just as good on a characteristic level as a force carbonated beer, at least based on these results.
Yeah, I was pretty shocked. I mean, part of me wanted the kegged beer to taste better to validate, my own thoughts when I switched over to kegging. But the bottle conditioned beer was great. I enjoyed all of those. In fact, those lasted much longer than the keg. Because people weren't coming in and out of my garage taking it, so I got to enjoy that beer probably over the course of about 2 months, and I really liked it.
One of the things about bottle conditioning that one of the benefits that some people have brought up is the fact that long-term storage tends to be a little bit better, or I guess can be a little bit better, because that yeast, you've got active yeast in there that can scrub that oxygen, any oxygen that's in the beer out. Whereas when you're packaging in a keg, maybe that's not so much the case, especially if you're packaging in a keg and bottling from that keg, which is another thing that we've recently looked at. In fact, we just published that article recently that Malcolm did, was bottling from a keg in different ways and the amount of oxygen that gets put into those bottles and whatnot. But yeah, I think there are there are some benefits to bottle conditioning that when looking at the fact that people can't seem to reliably distinguish a bottle conditioned beer from a force carbonated beer, it seems to be kind of show that, hey man, if you don't want a keg and you enjoy the zen of bottle conditioning.
And I think too, a lot of times when I'll sample homebrew, and it is bad and it is bottle conditioned, it generally comes from an overcarbonation or possibly an infection. I personally would never say that bottle conditioning by itself is going to make a beer that's less good than kegging. Just got to be careful about that overcarbonation.
Yeah, definitely. And I'll admit, in my experience, I've been known to say that force carbonated beer from a keg is probably side by side is going to be better than a bottle conditioned beer. And these results caused me to question that idea that I've had. So, I guess that's one of the nice things about being human, is every once in a while we're wrong. And so one of the questions though that remains and that we've tested out has to do with, what is the difference between one of the other variables, right, in your experiment, which you actually did after Ray did the one that we're going to talk about here in a minute, is the fact that the package that your beers were in were different. And so what Ray was wondering was, what would the difference be if we force carbonated a keg of beer and compared it to a naturally carbonated keg of beer?
Ray did this experiment, basically testing out the kind of theory that people have posited that CO2 was CO2 regardless of how you get it. So he brewed up an IPA, same thing as my experiment, where it was all done in one mash tun, one kettle, split off into 2 fermenters. And then he kegged up both those beers. One of them was placed in his keezer, set to the serving pressure, and let carbonate over the 1 to 2 weeks. The other one was put in his keg, where he measured out a specified dose of sugar, dumped that sugar in the keg, and allowed it to sit in his kitchen pantry for 2 weeks to naturally carbonate. After those 2 weeks, the naturally carbonated beer was put in his keezer next to his force carbonated beer. So for this experiment, Ray got a total of 15 participants. To establish significance, we would have needed 9 people to accurately identify the odd beer out. And in the end, only 6 were able to, which gave us a P of 0.38. So these results kind of were similar to mine in that the clarity was different between the Keyser beer and the naturally carbonated beer. So unlike mine, I think Ray noted that his naturally carbonated beer didn't seem to clear up after a month in the Keyser, whereas mine had. But regardless, we did note clarity difference right at the beginning of those 2 separate experiments.
It's really interesting to me that these beers ended up looking as different as they did, after he spent so much time with them cold conditioning.
And with Ray's, the p-value is 0.38, and with mine it was 0.12. So, Ray changed up the carbonation method, but kept the serving vessel the same. In mine, we changed up the carbonation method and the serving vessel. We're starting to get closer and closer to a smaller p-value. So maybe the more we're stacking these changes, the more it is changing the beer.
Yeah, the more different they become. But the fact is, we've got 2 force carbed versus naturally carbonated experiments that seem to show, or seem to support the notion at least, that CO2 really is CO2 and that carbonation is just carbonation, which is really, I think that's a kind of a cool validating thing for people who may not have the ability to jump into kegging right away, or those who just don't want to. And at the same time, it seems to show that those who swear by either of the methods as being better, may be doing so, and I'm speaking of myself here a little bit, because we are looking for some form of confirmation for the process that we use ourselves.
Yeah, very much so. I was definitely looking for that validation, and I did not find it.
Well, so does that mean you're going to switch over to bottle conditioning then?
Absolutely not.
Absolutely not. It's my case here as well. Yeah.
One of my main takeaways from this experiment was just a reminder of how much I hate bottling. It takes so long to clean the bottles, sitting on the floor, bottling those up and then capping them. It's just not for me. I understand why people do it, and everyone is different, but man, for me, just hooking up that quick disconnect to the keg, that's what I want to do.
Me too, man. Best way to go, in my opinion, for me specifically. This is one of those ones, if somebody were to come up and ask about bottle conditioning versus kegging, for me, I think the advice that I'm going to give is, it depends on what you're looking for. Both seem to work out just fine. But if you're looking to cut some time out of your packaging process and you want maybe a little bit more, I want to believe it so bad, just a little bit more control over that carbonation, and maybe a quicker, clearer beer, then kegging is the way to go. You have to have some money stowed away to do it for the most part. I've built, for my friends and myself, I think altogether I'm up to about 6 Keysers and 1 kegerator. And, for a 2-tap with decent faucets and, the tank and everything, you're looking at anywhere between $200 to upwards of $1,500, $2,000. So it's definitely an investment, but it's one that I'm glad that I made.
Same here. Either method can be used to carbonate a beer effectively. You should do what really works for you, and what you want to get out of brewing should play a major factor in terms of what you choose to do. For me, it's a Keyser.
Absolutely, man. I couldn't be more with you. Well, that is our show on packaging, at least the first one. We've got some more experiments planned to test different carbonation methods and whatnot. If you have any questions about this stuff, please feel free to ask in any of the forums that we participate in, or you can email any of us directly by putting our first name at brewlosophy.com. Thank you so much for listening. We hope it was as good for you as it was for us. Please consider supporting Brewlosophy so that we can continue to bring you this stuff more often. You can do so by going to brewlosophy.com/support. And don't forget to check out the rewards you can get for helping us out at patreon.com/brewlosophy. Follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter to keep up with what we're doing. Please send show feedback and Brew&A questions to marshall@brewlosophy.com. Cheers to all of our sponsors. We'll be back in a few weeks with the next episode of the Brewlosophy podcast. Until then, think beer.
Start off the morning with some hot tea, lemon and honey cause it soothes my throat. Put some herb in the bowl, yeah, it's homegrown. Ain't gotta go through the middleman no more. Life is good, the likelihood of me.
Looking for a new career? Welcome to Do HVAC Training Service Center in North Charleston. Enroll today in our comprehensive HVAC training hands-on field experience-based program, covering troubleshooting, maintenance, installation, and more on various HVAC systems and ductwork. We offer EPA and NAEP preparation and testing, along with various certifications. Enjoy payment options. Achieve certification in under 5 months. Enroll now for your new journey of skill development and career advancement. Log on to dewhvactrainingsc.com to inquire.